Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something that's moved incredibly fast on the international stage. Canada deciding to, well, scrap its digital services tax. You've brought some great sources that help cut through all the noise on this. Our mission really is to unpack what this tax actually was, why it blew up into such a big issue between the U.S. and Canada, and what this reversal signals for, trade and how we tax tech going forward. We want you to get the whole picture fast with all the key stuff.
It really is fascinating how quickly it all unfolded. It exposes so many layers, doesn't it? Economic, diplomatic.
Absolutely. That speed is something else. So let's start at the beginning. What was this Canadian Digital Services Tax, the DST?
Okay, so at its heart, the DST was basically a 3% tax. It was aimed at revenues made in Canada from certain digital services.
Okay, like what kind of services?
Think online marketplaces, digital advertising, social media platforms, and also companies making money off user data. And a key point, it was supposed to be retroactive.
Retroactive?
Yeah, going back to January 1st, 2022.
Wow, okay. And this wasn't hitting just any company, right? It was pretty targeted.
Exactly. It was specifically aimed at large corporations. We're talking global revenues over 750 million euros, and importantly, more than 20 million Canadian dollars generated from Canadian users.
So the big fish?
The big fish, definitely. And Canada figured this would bring in quite a bit of money. The estimate was around CAD $7.2 billion between 2023 and 2027, with about US $2 billion due almost immediately because of that retroactive piece.
Okay, so significant cash. And what was the rationale? Why did Canada feel the need to do this? Especially, you mentioned they were kind of waiting for a global agreement.
Right. The thinking in Canada was, well, there's this perceived gap. These huge tech companies operate here, use Canadian data, make money here, but maybe aren't paying tax in proportion to that activity. And while they supported the global OECD process, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, trying to get everyone on the same page for digital taxes, they felt they couldn't wait indefinitely.
Okay, makes sense from their perspective. But how did the U.S. take it?
Well, that's where things got really interesting. The U.S. government almost immediately flagged it as discriminatory.
Discriminatory? That's a loaded term in trade talks, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Because it implies the tax unfairly targets foreign companies over domestic ones. And let's be frank, the companies most affected were the big American tech players. Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, you know the ones.
So the U.S. saw it as specifically targeting their companies.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the friction just built through 2024. By mid-year, the Biden administration formally requested dispute consultations under the USMCA.
The trade deal, right? The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Exactly. And that agreement has teeth. It allows for potential retaliatory tariffs if one country believes the other is violating the terms. So this was a serious step.
And then things really escalated just recently, in late June 2025.
Oh, yeah, dramatically.
Yeah.
The Trump administration came in swinging. President Trump just abruptly suspended all trade talks with Canada, full stop. He called the DST, and I think this is a direct quote, a direct and blatant attack on the United States.
Wow. So very strong language, high stakes.
Extremely high stakes. It put huge pressure on Canada.
Which leads us right to this sudden reversal, the negotiations.
Yeah.
Canada moved incredibly fast here.
Lightning fast. On June 29th, 30th, basically right as the first payment was due.
The payment was due June 30th.
It was. And right then, Canada announced, nope, we're halting that payment. And more than that, they committed to actually introduce legislation to repeal the whole Digital Services Tax Act.
Just pull the plug entirely.
Completely. And this all happened just before a really critical deadline, July 21st, 2025, related to broader trade deal talks.
So it feels like Canada blinked right before that deadline hit. What was the deal happening behind the scenes?
Well, what we know is that Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Trump agreed to get back to the negotiating table by that same July 21st date. The goal now is apparently a new economic security agreement. And Canada's finance minister, François Philippe, framed the DST reversal publicly as being about supporting Canadian jobs, Canadian businesses, and, crucially, restarting those vital trade talks.
A strategic retreat, maybe?
You could certainly see it that way. A pivot to prioritize the broader relationship and avoid those retaliatory tariffs.
So how did this play out with the public, with experts? Because there were definitely people who supported this tax, right?
Oh, absolutely. Supporters felt strongly that this was about fairness, holding massive tech companies accountable. You know, the argument that they use Canadian user data, profit immensely, but don't pay a proportional share of tax here. One source put it very bluntly. Multinational tech companies do not pay their fair share of tax in Canada. That was the core argument for the DST.
But the critics had been warning about this exact scenario, hadn't they?
They had, consistently. They argued the DST violated trade principles, specifically under USMCA, and that it was just asking for trouble with the U.S., risking those retaliatory tariffs we talked about. We saw academics weigh in, too. Daniel Bayland at McGill, for instance, called the reversal a clear victory for Trump,
Implying Canada was kind of forced into it?
reflecting Canada's vulnerability in that negotiation. Yeah. And you saw similar sentiments bubble up in public discussions, like on places like Reddit. People saying things like, Canada pushed ahead, ignored the warnings, what do they expect? Basically arguing that the U.S. reaction was predictable.
So a real mix of reactions, frustration from DST supporters, I told you so, from critics.
Exactly. It really shows the different pressures and viewpoints all tangled up in this.
So where does this leave things now? What happens next?
Well, first, that June 30th payment is definitely not being collected. The actual legislation to repeal the DST still needs to pass, but that's the stated commitment. And trade talks between Ottawa and Washington are back on, aiming for that July 21st deadline for some kind of new agreement.
And what about the bigger picture for taxing tech? Is Canada just giving up on this idea?
Not necessarily giving up on the idea long term. Canada officially still supports that multilateral OECD approach. The hope is still to eventually bring in digital service taxes, but under a globally agreed framework. But for now, this specific unilateral DST is off the table. It ran headlong into U.S. trade policy and, frankly, the political reality of dealing with Washington, especially the Trump administration's stance.
So the focus shifts back to broader trade diplomacy with the U.S. while keeping an eye on that global OECD process.
That seems to be the path forward.
Yeah.
This whole episode, though, really highlights the tension, doesn't it? Canada's DST was this bold move trying to tax big tech directly, but it just collided with the realities of international trade power dynamics.
It really did. Okay, so the DST is shelved, waiting for repeal. Trade talks are back on. The OECD path is still the preferred long-term route, but clearly full of hurdles.
That sums it up pretty well. A lot of moving parts.
Definitely. So as you're thinking about all this, here's something provocative to consider. How do countries balance their own domestic tax priorities, like wanting big tech to pay more, with the hard realities of global trade and power politics? What does this Canadian experience really tell us about the messy, complicated future of taxing the digital world internationally? Lots to think about there.